is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper subject matter, that is, the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as the instrument to get hold of the absolute or as the medium through which one discovers it. A certain uneasiness seems justified, partly because there are different types of cognition, and one of them might be more appropriate than another for the attainment of this goal, so that we could make a bad choice of means. And partly because cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, and thus, without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error instead of the heaven of truth. This feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness through cognition what exists in itself is absurd, and that there is a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. For if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of absolute being, it is obvious that the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself, but rather sets out to reshape and alter it. If, on the other hand, cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium. Either way, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end, or rather what is really absurd is that we should make use of a means at all. It would seem, to be sure, that this evil could be remedied through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works, for this would enable us to eliminate from the representation of the absolute, which we've gained through it, whatever is due to the instrument, and thus get the truth in its purity. But this improvement would in fact only bring us back to where we were before. If we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it, then the thing, here, the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this accordingly superfluous effort. On the other hand, if the absolute is supposed merely to be brought nearer to us through this instrument without anything in it being altered, like a bird caught by a lime twig, it would surely laugh our little ruse to scorn if it were not with us, in and for itself, all along, and of its own volition. For a ruse is just what cognition would be in such a case, since it would, with its manifold exertions, be giving itself the air of doing something quite different from creating a merely immediate and therefore effortless relationship. Or if by testing cognition, which we conceive of as a medium, we get to know the law of its refraction, it is again useless to subtract this from the end result. For it is not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself whereby truth reaches us. That is cognition. And if this were removed, all that would be indicated would be a pure direction or a blank space. Hegel begins the introduction to the Phenomenology by situating us within the realm of what we can call epistemological concerns. And this is very much in tune with the sort of grand sweep of modern philosophy, which was in many respects dominated, at least in its theoretical approach, and the theoretical approach really did dictate the practical approach in many cases, by a focus on what it is that we can possibly know and what we're contributing to knowledge, and what conceals the truth from us, what reveals the truth to us. So there's that aspect. Hegel is going to talk about it in terms of cognition or Kenntnis. And you notice I've got here epistemological preliminaries to philosophy. In modern philosophy, for many of the people involved in it, epistemology really does become first philosophy, as opposed to metaphysics being first philosophy. Now, on the other hand, you can't get away from metaphysics. You can't get away from some sort of connection to being as such, or if you want to put it in terms of other things as well, to meaning, to some sort of overarching good. Hegel will actually talk in terms of the excellent at many points, as we've seen in the preface. And so we've got this absolute over here. And that constitutes sort of another pole to modern philosophy. On the one hand, if you look at figures like Descartes or Locke or Hume or Kant, what you're seeing is this intense emphasis on trying to figure out what it is that we can actually take as starting points, what we can rely upon, if anything, what it is that we, the knower, are doing through our knowing, through our acts of knowledge, through our organizing things, through imposing categories, as Kant says, through associating things, as Hume is going to say. But on the other hand, and at another pole, there's also this sense that, look, there's something bigger. There's something that we want to get to. We don't want to just be doing this sort of, essentially navel-gazing activity of enumerating the different ways in which we can get to know things and the different ways in which we can fail to know things. We want to actually know something. We want to know something not just about individual things, and we don't just want to do science in the sense of, laboratory experiments or engaging in natural history. We want to have a sense of the totality. We want to make sense out of the all. And so Hegel has got these two different moments here, cognition and the absolute. And the question is, what's the relationship between them? So he says it's a natural assumption that in philosophy, what's going on in philosophy, before we get to start to deal with its proper subject matter, the actual cognition of what truly is. So that would be metaphysics. And to a certain degree, that would also involve, say, philosophy of action, moral philosophy, philosophy of human nature. We have to engage in something else. One must first of all come to an understanding about cognition. And he's going to raise this dichotomy here. This, well, could it be this or could it be that? Two different possibilities. Do we look at cognition as something like an instrument, an apparatus that we bring to our world out there that we're experiencing, or perhaps turn inward when we're engaging in reflection, and thereby make sense out of things? Is cognition like an instrument? Is there an active sense, a productive sense to what's going on in knowledge, what's going on even in imagination? Or is it more like a medium? And when he says medium, he means something like a telescope, or a microscope, or just looking through glass as such, or looking through water. Or, you could think about what we're doing right now as a medium. It's kind of a weird one because it does involve an apparatus, which is doing weird things to, it's breaking down the light into its constituent parts. And I have no idea how a digital camera actually works, quite honestly, if you pressed me upon it. But, we tend to think of it as sort of like a medium. I suppose an analog camera would be much more medium and less apparatus. A digital camera is more apparatus and in some sense less medium. But these are the possibilities. And he says there's a certain uneasiness, a certain worry. Why? Because there's different kinds of cognition. There's different modes of getting to know things. And I think we're more or less familiar with this. Getting to know a person is a different kind of knowing than knowing, how to sing a song, or knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. Those are different types of cognition there. And we don't have to worry about trying to enumerate them right now. That's not the point that Hegel's trying to make. He just wants to say, look, there's different kinds of cognition, and so perhaps one type of cognition might be more appropriate than another for cognizing the absolute. And, that would make sense. Are you going to be able to understand the absolute through the processes of natural science? Probably not. Are you going to be able to do it through mathematics? We've already seen Hegel tackle that sort of thing back in the preface. Are you going to be able to do it through intuition? Hegel says no, because intuition is really just sort of random, whatever it is that we happen to feel at the time, and we kind of rationalize it, or we endow it with some dignity by thinking that it's revealing something to us. No, there's going to be a different kind of cognition involved, and the question is, well, what is that going to be? So he says, we could make a bad choice of means. We could pick the wrong way to go about figuring out what actually is the case. Not just what's the case right here or right now, but what's the case in toto, in the totality of things, including us. So it matters whether we pick an instrument or a medium. And this was really, an epistemological point. You could say that modern philosophy is dominated by this worry, by this concern about, wait a second, people have been saying that this is the way we get to know reality, this is the way we get to know the world, this is the way we get to know ourselves, this is the way we get to know God, if there is such a thing. Maybe, we're picking the wrong one. We have to be very careful, and we need to look at this end of things and figure out which ones are the appropriate ones. And if you look at some of the thinkers who I've mentioned, like John Locke, for example, or Immanuel Kant, or René Descartes, they are really focused, also Benedict Spinoza, really focused on figuring out what modes of cognition we ought to be using for what kinds of purposes. So, Hegel goes on and he says, cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, so if we don't have a precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error rather than the heaven of truth. And again, that is the nightmare of epistemological, speculation in the modern period. Maybe we're really insane. Maybe we're really being deceived by an evil genius, evil demon. That's coming from Descartes, right? Descartes didn't really think that, by the way, but that's what a lot of people have taken from Descartes. Maybe we can't rely on causality at all. Maybe that's just our brains or our minds just associating things that aren't really totally dependable. That's Hume's point. And then, Kant resolves that by saying, oh, don't worry about causality. It's not really out there in the world. We're imposing that on experience so that it can be experienced for us through the categories of the understanding. But you see this theme over and over again. We got to look at this stuff here before we worry about getting to the absolute. We have to really get this issue settled, or else we're going to pick the wrong thing, and we're going to be like the rest of those dummies through the history of philosophy who didn't have the right idea about this. That's another typical modern conception, that we can break with the past like that. So he says, this feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness, that's us, through cognition what exists in itself is absurd, and there's a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. This is skepticism. This is skepticism of a sort which says we can never really get to this thing over here that's most real, because there's always something in the way, and that something is the way in which we get to know the absolute. Now you can say, well, how do you know about that knowledge and about the absolute? And that's where Hegel's going with this. So he says, if cognition is an instrument for getting a hold of absolute being, we've got a problem, don't we? What happens when we use an instrument? Does an instrument leave alone what it is that it's working upon? It really depends on what kind of instrument, doesn't it? Think about what goes on with this camera. Are you getting the whole picture of what's going on here? Not exactly. There's editing software. Usually the light is not good enough, the way the camera is taking it, so I boost it up a little bit. The sound is usually not quite as strong as I'd like it to be, so I boost that up a bit as well. There's capacities for modifying what it is that you're supposed to be taking in. And, if you think about a camera, again, when you turn the camera towards something, you're selecting out a portion of what it is that's in your visual field. It's kind of interesting, too. I think about, I go to heavy metal concerts because I love heavy metal. Some of you may know that already. And one of the things that I do, and I'm kind of, a typical guy this way, a typical guy of the 21st century, is I get my iPhone, and I'll only do this a few times in the concert, but when I have an inkling that it's going to be a really great song, then I got the iPhone up and I'm recording it. Now, I'm looking through that viewfinder thing, and later on I can watch that. So, maybe it's Judas Priest and they're playing Living After Midnight, or, The Rage or something like that. And I am not taking in the same thing that the spectacle on stage actually is sort of presenting to me. I'm looking at a little screen, aren't I? As opposed to, sort of just taking it in. And there's something about the act of interposing the camera there that changes the experience as well. Now I got to like concentrate on trying to hold it steady. And funny enough, because we never get, super great seats like front row, because those are very expensive. You can see when I'm taking my film or my image of it, that there'll be some other people in front of me, and you can see their screens lit up, filming the same thing. So, that's a sort of prime example. We could think of many other examples. The point is that an instrument modifies the thing that it is working upon. So Hegel will say, if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of absolute being, if our active, not knowing or investigating is how we get to know absolute being, if it's active like that, then the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself. So we're not getting what it is in itself. Instead, we're getting what it is for cognition, or what it is for us, or what it is for this particular instrument of cognition. So he says it reshapes it and alters it. We're not getting what it is that we wanted to in the first place. This is the dialectic at work, by the way. You think that you're doing X, and it turns out that you're not just doing X, you're also doing Y, and Y kind of screws up what's going on with X, so that X doesn't turn out to be what you were doing at all, just what you intended to do. Now he says, so that's a problem. What if cognition is just a medium? What if it's something like, seeing through a window, or hearing? We hear through the air. The sound waves impinge upon us. The air is the medium. The sound waves are what are carried into our ears. So I've drawn sort of arrows here. That seems to be, like the absolute is coming to us then, and the medium is not really doing anything. It says it's a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us. But the problem is, we don't get the light of truth as it is in itself. What we get is what that medium allows to pass through. So think of it as sort of a filtering system. If you change the air, you change the sound. As a matter of fact, this is a great example, sound, because one of the reasons why I have to tweak the sound as I process these videos is because the acoustics in this place where I'm shooting are not particularly good, and there's some background noise, so there's some other things going on here. And other places where I shoot it might sound very echoey. That's because the medium is not quite the same. So if we're doing that with knowledge, if knowledge is a medium through which the light of truth just sort of comes through, if we're not making an active contribution to it, we're still getting it through some sort of filtering, through some sort of selection process, one that we're not really conscious of. So, take for example light. We look at flowers. Flowers are very beautiful. I love flowers. I'm very interested in them and growing them and sniffing them and, looking at them. I even wanted to be a florist at one time, believe it or not. We don't see flowers the way that bees do we? Bees can see into the ultraviolet. And turns out that when you put flowers under ultraviolet lights, and you look at them with an ultraviolet camera, you can see that it doesn't look quite the same. Same with butterflies. Also, the smell. I'm sure that the flowers smell very different to bees than they do to us. Same with taste. So the medium can also end up being a kind of contributor. And again, we're dealing with how it is for us, and we're not dealing with the absolute as it is in itself in that case. So he says, either way we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end. That means that we're trying to do something, but we're somewhat self-defeating in what we're trying to do because we're picking a tool or a means, we're picking something that is going to prevent us from actually being able to do what it is that we intend to do. So again, this is the dialectic at work. The fact that we can register this, the fact that we can understand this, the fact that we can make sense of this, that's the dialectic. So he says, it seems rather absurd we should make use of a means at all. So he says, how could we get around this? This evil could be remedied, this badness could be dealt with, through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works. So that's what epistemology does. It looks at the mind, or it looks at the act of knowledge, or it looks at the human being and says, how does this knowing, this investigating, this coming to understand, how does that work? Let's focus on that. Before we worry about what it is that we're knowing, let's figure out, how does knowledge actually work? How does thinking actually work? And that's this grand movement of epistemology. So we can focus on the instrument, or we can focus on the medium. And with both the instrument and the medium, one tack that we can take is we can say, let's try to figure out what in fact this is adding in, and then we'll just subtract that. So once we know that it's doing this to the object that we're working upon, we'll just take that part away, and then we've got the object as it is in itself for us. Or, with the medium. If we know that the medium is turning everything yellow, let's take that yellowness out, and then we'll have the absolute restored to us. Now, is that going to work? He says, if we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it. So we're taking the absolute as we're getting it through the instrument, and we're trying to remove the effects of the instrument so that we get the absolute by itself. He says, it becomes exactly what it was before this effort. We didn't know what the hell this was in the first place. That's what we're trying to figure out through knowing, right? So if we try to take out what the instrument does, we're actually removing the part that tells us about what's over here. And we can say the same thing with the medium. He says, by testing cognition, which we conceive of as a medium, if we get to know the law of its refraction, we're using a visual metaphor here, it's useless to subtract this from the end result, for it's not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself whereby truth reaches us, and that is cognition. So if we're removing that, all we would get is a pure direction or a blank space. We wouldn't get something that we can actually work with. Now there's a third possibility that Hegel considers in terms of instrument. He says maybe the instrument is less intrusive than we think. Maybe it's, and he's got this metaphor here that a lot of us probably can't relate to too well. Maybe it's like, a lime stick catching a bird and bringing it close to us. Now, a lime stick is a sticky stick, right? So imagine something like flypaper, only on a stick, and you see a bird down there, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to catch that bird. And you touch it with the stick, and now the bird can't get away. So, think of something like a butterfly net or a live trap or, whatever works for you. And you're bringing the thing to you undamaged, unaltered, maybe screwed up a little bit, panicked, whatever's going to happen with the bird or insect. You're going to do that now with the absolute. So the instrument is just to grab onto the absolute and bring it in over here. Hegel says this is a ruse, this is a trick. He says, the absolute would laugh at our little ruse if it were not with us in and for itself all along and of its own volition. That's an interesting thing to say. That means that the absolute, without us realizing it, is already over here. And here's a little bit of the story, where we're going with this. The absolute is getting to know itself through us, through our processes of cognition, through what it is that we're trying to make sense of, through how we're improving, over time, this process. So the instrument is not so innocent, it's not so undamaging, it's not so unintrusive as we thought that it was when we made it out to be. But it's not the end of the story. So Hegel is going to finish up this section by saying that none of these are actually ways of thinking about this that are actually going to work for us. So what are we actually left with here? Should we just stop doing epistemology altogether and say, well, let's just jump right into the absolute? Well, that's not going to work. Now that we've brought up this worry, we're going to be inhabited by it for a while until we can resolve this worry. And that's part of what the introduction is really grappling with. So this first section here, it's not encapsulating the entire introduction, but it is setting the stage for all the other themes that are going to emerge in this section. Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself and actually cognizes something, it is hard to see why we should not turn round and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? Indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth, supporting its scruples and inferences on what is itself in need of prior scrutiny to see if it is true. To be specific, it takes for granted certain ideas about cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and assumes that there is a difference between ourselves and this cognition. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent, separated from it, and yet is something real. Or in other words, it presupposes that cognition, which, since it's excluded from the absolute, is surely outside of the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as fear of the truth. One way to address the problem of skepticism, this worry that we can never really know anything because what we take to be knowledge isn't really so, or the processes by which we're coming to know things are somehow distorting them or falsifying them. One way to deal with that is to suggest that skepticism itself needs to be skeptical of that very skepticism. Now that's rather self-reflexive to say that, but so let me say that one more time. You can say that skepticism is self-defeating by the way in which it makes sense out of the very problem of knowledge. Or put in other terms, skepticism, which seems to be saying, well, you're making assumptions and we don't want to make assumptions, is making a whole bunch of assumptions itself. And this characterizes the movement of modern epistemology that Hegel is kind of undoing in this section. So he says, the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science. And now you've got, he's not talking about this here, but you've got sort of a divided consciousness. You've got, people who are actually doing things. Science actually cognizes something. Doesn't necessarily have to be the absolute. It could just be the objects of the natural sciences. It could be, psychology, looking at the human mind, its makeup, how it works. Could be history, right? But there's science, there's some sort of discipline, and it's getting to know things. And those who are involved with that are not worried so much about falling into error, although they may be, suspicious. If you're doing historical research, you have to be a bit credulous of certain documents and certain claims, but they're actually getting on with the work. And they're getting to know things in the process. Are they knowing them perfectly? Perhaps not. Do they sometimes make mistakes? Yes, that's true. But they're not paralyzed by this fear of error that keeps them from actually doing anything. If you want to think about this in non-scientific terms, but in relationship terms, think about, convincing yourself that somebody loves you or not. So if you're going to wait to act for the, absolute certainty that this person loves you before you enter into a relationship with them and, date and get to know them and get married and have a life together and all this sort of stuff, well, you're never going to do it, right? Because the very getting on with it and getting to know them is part of how you figure it out in the first place. And if you just worry about, I got to be 100% certain about this, you'll never get the opportunity to be 100% certain. And it works that way with disciplinary knowledge of the world as well. So he says, we should perhaps distrust this very mistrust. Why? Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? It's a mistake to be so obsessed with getting it 100% right, with attaining perfect certainty and only then moving on, or only sticking within the realm of that which we can be 99.99999% sure about. You know, Hegel is really being a pragmatist here in many respects. And I don't mean just a pragmatist like William James, I mean a pragmatist like Blaise Pascal or Maurice Blondel as well. So he says, indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth. What is it taking for granted as truth? All this part down here. And this is what we just looked at before, right? We've got ourselves, cognition as either an instrument or a medium, and the absolute. And we're supposed to use this instrument to grasp what's real, what's true over here. And so we've got, reality or truth. And now the implication here is that there is actually some sort of bar between the instrument, the medium, how we're getting to know the reality or truth, so that this is actually, in some respect, false. There's another assumption being made too, which is that we are not that cognition. We are something different than cognition, when actually we are that. That is part of what we are. So there's these sort of artificial separations that are being imposed by this point of view. And that's part of why it gets itself into such a tizzy about this. He says, it assumes there's a difference between ourselves and this cognition, and it presupposes the absolute stands on one side, cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet is something real. And it presupposes the cognition, which is surely outside of the truth, right, which is false, is also at the same time true, because it is really cognition. It is really what it is. But then does this dividing line really hold up? We know something about the cognition. He says, it presupposes that cognition, which since it's excluded from the absolute, is outside of the truth, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself instead as fear of the truth. And I want to just spend just a moment here to go a little bit beyond this and shoot into some of the other sections. When Hegel's talking about truth here, truth is something you could think of as bleeding over outside of the absolute. This isn't the best way to put it, because the absolute does encompass everything. We're already inside of the absolute, but we just don't realize it. But truth bleeds out of that and gets into all these other things as well. So there's more truth that we have access to than we know what to do with. We're not able to recognize the true and all of the interconnections between the true as such, so we take it to be false, and then we're worried about it, we get scared, and then we don't do anything, and we say, I need to withdraw instead. And so long as we do this, and we keep to ourselves, we're never going to get to know the absolute.